Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third of our three sessions, or at least the third of three sessions in this series about generative AI in higher education. We've talked about some of the ways this is impacting work in the classroom. Alaina, in our first session, led us through some really good conversations about academic integrity and what that might mean on a broader scale rather than just plagiarism checkers. And I tried to think about different ways we might lean into our human domain as educators, as teachers in the classroom, just to sort of emphasize the importance of that ethos, skill set, the messy, fleshy, bloody thing that we all are, human reality. In the next session, that was session two, that was last week already, we wanted to think a little bit more about how this general purpose technology, this generative AI that we're all wrestling with, might actually be the key to unlocking some different ways to think about assignments and activities in the classroom. How can we use it for our students in a way that models effective and ethical usage so that they don't just use it to offload assignments, but actually learn through the course of using these technologies. Learn not only the outcomes we want them to learn, but also learn about the technology itself, embracing this idea of AI literacy, broader than digital literacy, an AI literacy focused on that technology. Today, I think what we're going to do is talk a little bit about ways that we can use it, not necessarily in the classroom, because that was last session, but in our work as academics, in our work as educators, because we hear about all these benefits to generative AI, all the gains, all the productivity shortcuts, all the ways that it can be used to make our work and our life a little better. But what are those? How do we embrace that in our work here or wherever that might be? So that's kind of where we're coming at this today. Let me share my screen and get this PowerPoint going. It's here somewhere. This is us. This is what we're talking about today, academic agility, integrating AI into instructional practices and into the life of us as instructors. We're going to talk a little bit about a framework for generative AI usage. And again, I just want to give my general disclaimer that I've been giving throughout these sessions. This isn't the rule. This isn't, I mean, nobody at our university has told me that this is it. This is the actual policy. We don't have that yet. We're along with 42% of other organizations in the country as not really having a policy yet, but at least working toward it. So this is just a framework for thinking about how we might want to approach this. We're going to talk about a little bit of example, or we're going to present some examples and tools, and then we're going to get into some of the ethical concerns and ideas that are sort of entrenched in what we're talking about today, but a little bit more broadly applicable to some of the things we've been addressing over the different sessions we've been here together. So how do we build this framework? When we talk about productivity advantages of generative AI, I think a lot of what we're hearing, a lot of what we're seeing in the workplace is these examples that I'm sharing on the screen right now. This comes from a research report that Asana recently put out, and it talks about the ways that people might be using generative AI at work to gain time back, essentially. Email generation is one of the most sort of the most prevalent things that people are using AI for. Information summarization and content generation are two of the others. Now, again, we need to think through this in terms of our roles as educators and what it is we're actually trying to do in the classroom. Email generation may be a popular way to employ generative AI, but is it the right thing to do when a student writes to us and talks about some sort of trauma or tragedy in their life, some sort of difficulty they're having with a pain point in the classroom? We don't want necessarily to offload that to generative AI to just write that response. Some people may argue that having generative AI write a first draft that we then go in and tweak may be an appropriate use of that. But that's not why I became a teacher. I want to talk to my students and connect with them. Email generation directly for work with students might not be the way to go. Now, of course, if your boss sends you a 5-page email that 12 other people respond to before you get a chance to look at it, maybe having generative AI help you understand what the salient points of that email are, maybe that is a good way to use this technology. I'll talk a little bit more about information summarization when I share an example in a minute, but again, this is something that I think we're finding that students are using, especially in some of the writing classes, where they're just generating summaries from generative AI and then using those wholesale in their paper, realizing that a summary from generative AI has limited value, I think is a key that students will start to learn as they work their way into becoming more familiar with generative AI. But is that something that we could do ourselves? Is that something that we could also repurpose in our work? And again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Content generation leads into this use case for education that Asana shared, which is the idea of goal setting. And if you think about that in terms of individual students, it might seem a little scary at first. Sort of the implication is that you're inputting student work into a generative AI database and then asking it for insights into student work. I would caution against that at this point, but I would remind you that we've talked about this before, baked into our Signals platform is a little bit of a generative AI predictive algorithm. It's looking at what students have done in previous classes. It's looking at what students are doing in your class, and it's giving you some information about them. I would, I look at Signals almost every day when I'm teaching a class. I don't ever act solely based on the information that I find there, but it is helpful in trying to think about where these students have come from, where they're going, what might be currently happening in the classroom in a way that I might not be able to see just by looking at student work. So when you think about goal setting, I think it's important to kind of take a broader view and realize that some of this tech is already really embedded in what we're doing. But when you think about how we might actually use this, apart from some of the common things we're hearing about, I do think there are some ways we can really employ the tools that we've been talking about, some of these generative AI tools and strategies to help us in our work as academics. And I broke down my thoughts into these 4 stages. They just seemed helpful to me in kind of trying to see about different ways we might think about this. The first stage, I think, is when we're beginning any type of work and we're just looking for insights and snapshots. Maybe when you're researching or reviewing materials, you might take comprehensive notes on that work. We all remember days with books open in front of us on the table, jotting down ideas, some of which connect to what we're reading, some of which connect to other things we're doing. Capturing those central observations and those notes might be something that we could then put into a generative AI tool to help us understand some of the broader implications of the notes that we're taking. If we're conducting a lit review, that's an example I'll share in a minute, where we might need to be able to briefly but quickly access information from a bunch of different sources. Generative AI might be able to help us with that. If you're doing field research or experiments, you might be able to record observations and any unexpected results and initial interpretations, and then ask for that to be spit back to you in a form that helps you to interact with it a little bit differently. If you're at an academic conference, you want to just take notes on a panel that you're looking at, and then see if some of those ideas are relevant to other work that you might be doing. If you're grading student papers or exams, again, I'm going to say I don't think it's a good idea to throw a student paper directly into a generative AI window, but you might take notes using generative AI and then become aware of broader trends or concerns that are arising throughout the course. Maybe there's a concept or an idea that you could make clearer or more explicit if only you realized the trends in the grading work that you're doing. After that, I think you can use these tools for ideation and analysis. Take those notes, throw them into an AI tool, and ask them to interpret or synthesize or summarize the ideas, finding a way to look at patterns and pull out different insights or ideas that might not be readily apparent to you. If you miss a meeting, as I sometimes do, take the notes from that meeting, take the follow-up report, take the minutes, and throw those into a generative AI tool and ask if there are action items you need to address. You're always going to want to check these things. I'm not saying that this is going to be a flawless practice, but I do think it's one way that you might find yourself saving a little bit of time. For evidence and examples, I think this is something you might, again, do with notes that you've put in. Instead of having to manually search through notes or maybe some past lectures that you've written and typed up, you could just ask the AI tool to help find relevant examples or to make connections between different ideas that you've previously shared. You can ask the AI to generate pros and cons based on your notes for different ideas or different topics. Of course, as I said, you're going to want to verify the things that you get back from generative AI, but I think it will be a potentially useful practice. I'll just share right now, really briefly. I am teaching a new class, a class that I haven't taught in years, so new to me for the first time in a while. And I have some of my old notes from when I taught the class previous, a couple of guidance lectures that I wrote and things like that. So I threw those into generative AI this morning. And just as a way of sort of reacquainting myself with some of the broader themes and seeing if they align with the new version of the course that's coming out or that I'll be teaching, do the topics that I addressed in these different areas still match up? Where do I need to fill in any shortfalls? It was an interesting practice. I think ultimately it saved me probably a little bit of time sort of figuring all this out. I still have a lot of writing to do, but it was fun thinking about talking with you all today, thinking about like, is this actually going to be a useful activity for me? And I think ultimately it probably was. The fourth stage of this that I want to mention is integration and iteration. Consider how all of the steps that we've just discussed might be applied to writing tasks, analytical tasks, new guidance for a class that you're teaching. You can use the time saved on your note organization to put into other aspects of your work. So if you can use AI to help you organize or prioritize tasks, if you can investigate how AI could help you analyze large bits of text or data sets, I think those are all ways that we might be able to use it. Now, what does that look like, in reality? We're going to share some examples. I want to just start with a couple really quickly that might be old hat to some of you, but might be interesting. Let me pull this up here. I just saw that Adobe Acrobat within their PDF reader has an AI assistant, but you have to pay for it. This tool called Chat PDF is free with limited usage. And what it does is it turns a PDF into a kind of dynamic interaction that you might be having with it. You just drop a PDF here. I dropped one in before to have an example. So this is a researched article. There's settings on this tool that keep all the information contained within the chat that you're having. So it's not training itself. It's not broadcasting this information. It's just keeping it all right here in this one window. And if you're doing a lit review for a research article, it can be draining to look at and assess dozens of articles, trying to see if they fit into what you're talking about, if they're even relevant, and you're basing that often on just an abstract or a title. My wife is a university researcher. And she was saying, yeah, I just read the abstracts. After a while, the abstracts start to blend. And while I read the abstracts and most of the article myself, that initial stage of just seeing whether or not something's relevant, I think can be really shortcut here. So you drop the PDF in and then immediately spits back um, these possible ways that you could consider exploring this PDF. I haven't done any of this now. Let's just ask this question of Chat PDF and see what happens here. So I know from experience that what it's trying to do is show me page numbers where this information is from. That is almost always incorrect. So, don't come up with citations based on this. But it's a quick shortcut of seeing whether or not this is relevant to what you might be working on. I'm writing an article on personalized learning using AI-powered tools. What does this article say about that? And then here's some information. And I can look at this really quickly and think to myself, okay, I probably need to read this article and see how this connects. Or I can think to myself, boy, I was fooled by the title. This doesn't connect at all. And I can have saved myself quite a bit of time. Uh, there's no shortcut for academic scrutiny. And it's also fun, right? I'm going to print this thing out with a highlighter. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to go through this word for word, circling and writing exclamation points and check marks and getting really excited about the ideas. But I'll only do that once I know that it's actually going to be relevant to what I'm working on. And this tool, I think, is one way of cutting down on that time. Another thing that I found that's been really helpful is this PDF to podcast tool. I tried this earlier and it didn't work sharing the audio via Zoom. But basically what happens is you drop a PDF in here and it turns it into an audio file. If, like me, you walk your dog for upwards of 2 hours a day, it can be really useful to have podcasts to listen to while you're out roaming the neighborhood. It's a shortcut way for me to, again, interact with a research PDF to determine whether or not it seems like it's going to be useful to what I'm doing in my research. But a lot of our courses here also have PDF sources that students need to interact with. And sometimes that can be a little bit overwhelming. So providing a tool like this to a student and saying, hey, I know you've got to read that 18-page article for your discussion board that's due on Thursday, maybe listen to it instead. There are other tools like this out there, but I think this one I've found to be fairly reliable. It's no shortcut for actually interacting directly with the text. I'm a writer. I love words. I love to see them on the page. But I do think that if we think about generative AI and AI-based tools as potentially saving time so that we can more closely focus on the intrinsic aspects of our job, the empowering things that we love doing, I think these are some ways we might get there. But I know that Alaina's got more that she wanted to share as well. So let me share this PowerPoint again, and I'll turn it over to her.
Yes, so the first sort of, next slide. So the first sort of thing that I've used it for in my own sort of teaching practices, as I realize announcements are something that get really tricky, and trying to get students to read the announcements that you're putting in there. And sometimes it can be difficult to come up with an attention-getting title. And generative AI is a great way to help me sort of start to create those titles and things like that. And you can put it in to, so this first example that I have here is like, please give me 10 humorous and attention-getting titles for a short announcement on generative AI and academic integrity. And you can see that it gives, we have AI's essay fiesta, from cheaters to creative thinkers. So thinking about what is going to be in that content to figure out a way to do that. From plagiarism to plagiar what? Exploring generative AI's impact on honesty. So finding ways to engage with your students when you sort of have that brain lull at the end of the day as you're sort of working through things and you want to come up with something creative, but you just can't find something. I also do something in my course that I call my brain breaks, where every Monday I post sort of a fun announcement that doesn't necessarily have to do specifically with the content, but has some sort of fun way for students to engage with each other. One that I did was recently, because it came right around the April Fool's Day. So I put together a brief announcement about the history of April Fool's Day as sort of a fun icebreaker for students. And so I was like, I needed a catchy title. Can you give me 10 titles? And this is, these are the sort of things that it came up with that allowed me to be as creative and witty as possible with limited brain capacity, because sometimes at the end of the day you just don't have the capacity for sort of being creative, and this can be a good jumping off part for that ideation and helping you sort of get those creative juices flowing again to figure it out, because you don't necessarily have to take these titles exactly as they are. You can mix and match and ideate and collaborate with generative AI. And I think that's the key when you're using it for these things, is collaboration and treating it as though it is a partner to bounce ideas off of. So if I have these 10 titles and say like, oh, I really like title number 5, can you give me some more versions of this, of number 5? And it will generate another 10 titles that are still on that same theme of that one that you identified from the previous thing. And so you have the ability to collaborate, or I don't want to use this word, so can you give me titles that talk about this topic but doesn't use this specific phrase? And so it's a really interesting collaborative partner that way. Next one, too long didn't read. I don't know about you, but I know that I have a tendency, especially in my announcements when I'm trying to, because sometimes I will treat those announcements as though they are lectures on a specific topic, and they can get very long for students. And so something that I am going to start employing is, as I'm looking at that, help me summarize the key elements of this to create a succinct summary of long announcements or emails, so that I can allow my students or colleagues to delve in more deeply at their own discretion. So inputting my announcement into generative AI and say, hey, can you give me, and I literally put a TLDR, for too long didn't read, summary of this announcement, and it picks out some of the key points that I can then interact with and say, oh no, this point isn't as important as maybe generative AI thought it was, so I want to fix this, and really making sure that it's a collaboration. So you're not sort of just copying and pasting this wholesale, but it gives you a way to really think about what are the main points of this particular announcement, this particular email that I want to get across. I know I'm probably not the only person who has experienced this frustration when they post announcements and feel like students didn't read them. And so I think having some of this succinct summary at least gets the main points to the students that you need to get, and they can delve into the additional content a little deeper, sort of at their leisure. And I think that's something, as we think about it, how it can save time for us, but also how we can use generative AI to save time for students so that they get the main ideas that they need, and then have the ability to go back and learn some of the other pieces. Next slide. And I think both of those examples do what I like to call keeping the human in the loop, which is not a phrase that I've come up with. It's a phrase that's used quite frequently in generative AI and artificial intelligence. And that's a practice that requires the active involvement of human beings in the development, training, and operation of AI systems. So making sure at all points that we're having sort of a collaboration with the generative AI. It's not just doing things for us. And the reasons that we really need to be able to do this is, one, it ensures accuracy. So if we have humans it helping to train the AI, helping to operate the AI systems and how it produces its results, we're going to get more accurate information and more accurate data from it. Because, as we said in an earlier presentation, generative AI just wants to help us. They want to do what we want it to do. It's that very eager assistant that wants to give us the exact information that we need and want. And so if we want that to be as accurate as possible, we need to be a part of that training model and operating it in a way and engineering our prompts that get us the most accurate information. Another reason is that it reduces bias. Because these large language models are based on algorithms and math, there is the possibility to go to the lowest common denominator and sort of what is most frequently held information or beliefs or things like that. And so in order to reduce sort of that bias towards a single perspective, we need to be interacting with generative AI as a collaborative partner. It also helps us provide ethical oversight. Generative AI very easily could start giving information that is both inaccurate and biased to the point that it becomes an ethical issue. And how do we keep that from happening? By being involved in the process. And finally, it helps us understand why AI has made the decisions that it's made. Why does AI give us the information that it gives us? Why does it respond to certain questions in certain ways? How, when it's creating a summary, as we collaborate with that, how does it decide what the most important points are based on, is it doing it based on the organization? Is it doing it based on looking at things like bullet points and pulling those out? And how can we then look at that to make our prompt more clear that gives us exactly what we need it to do, but also give us insight into how it sort of made that decision so that we can make it better on the next go round as we continue to collaborate and interact with it. Next slide. So to paraphrase Shakespeare, to use or not to use, that is the question. This is where we get into some of those ethical considerations about when we should use generative AI and when we shouldn't, and how we sort of do that. Next slide. And so I really wanted to focus this sort of discussion around the International Center of Academic Integrity, which is a well-respected resource when it comes to academic integrity across the world. They have defined what they call their 6 fundamental values of academic integrity. And these are honesty, trust, fairness, respect, responsibility, and courage. And under each of these, you'll see that I sort of pulled out. So they have this link that is here in this slide goes to their report on this. And there are several expectations and behaviors that they list under each of these. And so I just sort of pulled out one for each based on what generative AI can do and where we see these sort of intersect with these values. Next, and we'll delve into these next in the next couple slides a little more deeply. So, honesty, giving credit where credit is due. So thinking about how did the developer train its tool? I noticed Kira Heskey mentioned to a point about, you know, putting copyrighted material into generative AI, and where does that come from? When you're thinking about how the developer trained its tool, thinking about what is the source of the information it's using, and being able then to find original sources if you're using this as background research or background resources. So being able to take what you maybe have in a summary and find resources that support that you're going back to sort of those original sources, because most generative AI tools use a broad database of information that is accessible on the internet, things that are sort of not behind paywalls. And so thinking about where this information might come from and being able to cite that. Also, if you're looking at using generative AI tools, sort of getting beyond the generative AI tools that write, if you're using something like DALL-E, which is a generative AI tool that creates generative AI images, thinking about how those developers trained that tool in order to create those images. I mentioned in an earlier session about a class action lawsuit that is currently engaged against the developers of DALL-E because they used copyrighted artwork that was available on the internet in like internet stores for people to purchase those images, but they used that to help train its tool without the permission of the original artist. And so they're using that original artwork in order to create new generative AI artwork. So does that, if we're asking students to use a tool like that, are we engaging in our most honest practices? Then, which I think goes hand in hand with respect. So what is the impact of your use on creators and users? Does the tool disclose that it has the permission to use the work of others, and how does that? And not only in terms of how that uses information that it's gathered, and does it have the permission to use the information that it's gathered, but how does the tool utilize user data? So thinking about, especially if you're going to use this to help analyze trends in the classroom and things like that, how does it protect user data? How does it use any data that you input into the tool in order for further development and training of its tool? If that's the case, then certain information might not be something that you want to input into that tool. If it's just using it for a single use and it doesn't actually save the chats and things like that in order to help train its tools for future use, then maybe there might be an ability to put some other information in there. But really thinking about how it utilizes user data in its development and training. And then responsibility. How should you model good behavior for your students? So are you disclosing any use of generative AI when you actually use it within your classroom? I know when I'm using it to help with a title, I very clearly tell the students what chat, I usually use ChatGPT, and that I used it to help create this title. So telling them how you use the tool and what tools you use models the behavior that you want to see them do in the classroom. Next slide for the next three. So trust. I think this goes back to that previous one of responsibility. How do I promote transparency in the classroom? Set clear expectations, including noting in assignment instructions whether or not the use of generative AI is allowed and how they're allowed to use it. Looking at fairness. How do I apply any policies with consistency? This, I think, is a big thing. Applying the policies with consistency means abiding by the same expectations you set for your students. If you set the expectation early on that generative AI is not allowed to be used in your classroom or in your assignments or something, then you yourself should not be using generative AI in order to help support your teaching practices. So making sure that you are abiding by the same set of expectations that you place on your students. And then courage. So how can I take risks and accept failure? I think this is sort of the key, is recognizing that we're all learning with this new technology, instructors and students alike. So having the ability to have those conversations with students about where generative AI may work or not work, and be willing to acknowledge where you may fall short of your own expectations. Um, and sort of how to do that within sort of our greater, I think, culture of care, but knowing when to have those conversations and how to have those conversations with students, and be open and honest about where you found that it worked or didn't work, because I think that then goes back to modeling that behavior for students to say, hey, this doesn't work well for this kind of thing, so maybe you want to try using it for this instead. Or sharing that I tried to use it to create a summary. Here's a summary that it gave me. It wasn't a great summary that it gave me. So here's how I collaborated with generative AI in order to get a better summary of the information that I was trying to summarize. Here's where it was accurate or not accurate. And here's how I changed that in order to make this more accurate for you. And so being willing to acknowledge your usage and where the tool has its failures, because it's not a perfect tool. And I think that really, that air of transparency and being willing to have those conversations with students is a really important piece of this as we look at when we should use generative AI and when we should not.
There's a robust conversation going on in the chat. So if you're here live, you can see it. If you're watching the recording, you missed out. It's a lot of fun. Uh, People are handing out bags of popcorn and balloons. Uh, I wanted to say, we started these webinars, or I remember on the first day of this, kind of just disclosing that, I teach the writing classes, and this kind of hit me in a really difficult, really hard way. I wasn't really sure how to think about it. I think the biggest mistake that we can make is to not think about it, right? I think we need to continue to have these conversations. Do we know the answer to some of these things yet? Not really. Um, and I think we're in a stage where potentially we need to just be how should I say this? Consistent within our own domain. So if you're teaching a class and you lay down rules and guidelines in your class and you model usage, such as Alaina was talking about within your class, then that becomes what's acceptable there. And I think that's in some ways would make a leap. It's no different than the fact that many teachers would grade many papers in many different ways. Many teachers would teach the same concepts in many different ways. We ask something of our students, not just course outcome wise, but critical thinking wise and soft skill wise, when they adapt to different teachers and throughout different courses. Different teachers have different policies. I think we're in a stage where we're allowed to experiment a little bit, but we need to be aware of the ethical minefield that surrounds some of this. Two things I wanted to mention relevant to what Alaina was talking about. In one of my courses, and again, these are writing classes, freshman comp classes, one of my weekly guidance lectures has an entire section written by AI. It's like a paragraph. It's like a chunky paragraph. And the next paragraph then tells students, hey, that paragraph you just read was written by AI. Let's talk about why that paragraph was not very good. And then the rest of my lecture tries to break down what the failings were in that previous paragraph in terms of information, in terms of style, in terms of critical thinking. In a way, I'm using the old scared straight mentality because I'm dealing with kids who are taking freshman comp or adults older than me who are taking freshman comp, students. I feel like some of these more nuanced discussions can happen later in other classes. But along with what Alaina was talking about, disclosing your use and using it for a purpose, I think can really help motivate students and get them to understand some of the ideas here. And just another anecdote I'll share, Alaina mentioned the idea that these tools want to please us. And I think that's pretty dangerous. My daughter recently was applying for a job. So we were kind of on the phone. We were talking about different ways she might prepare herself for this interview, and she knows what she's doing. She doesn't need me. But I was like, you know what we should do? We should put the job description and your resume into ChatGPT. We might have actually used Claude, um, and ask it where you match up, where you don't match up. So we did that. And Claude thought she was a fantastic match. And then I realized, we probably shouldn't tell it that it's you because it wants to please us. It wants to see the ways in which this person lines up with this thing. So by then we cleared that out. We tried something else, went into a different area, and we asked it again. Here's the job description. Here's a candidate. How does this candidate match up? And it gave some pretty interesting and useful information in terms of, again, gaps and shortfalls, which might end up providing talking points for an interview. But again, I think the key there is sort of disambiguating from you and an AI trying to please you and making these things into test cases or examples that might provide slightly better or more less biased information, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Because and or creating you can also what's interesting with generative AI is you can create a persona. So say you want to do something very specific in your classroom and have this sort of exercise where you write a paragraph and have it break it down. You can ask generative AI to assume a character, giving it information about a student from a specific demographic, or letting them know I'm a first year writing instructor. I have these credentials. Write a paragraph about X, Y, and Z, and it will make the writing to be what it perceives should be the expected tone and writing of that persona. And so you're able to sort of craft it in a way that as you're engineering your prompt, saying, hey, I want you to work from this perspective. And so that can give you some interesting and different ways that it might give you different ways that it creates the output based on what it knows about the character or persona that you're using for that particular element. If you want to have it compare, say you want it to write from, I want this to be from the perspective of a C student, a student who gets mostly C's. What it may produce might actually include specific errors, but it's doing that on purpose because you've asked it to do something based on that level of writing. And so I think that is an interesting a way to maybe come up with examples of things to have discussions about in your classroom as you're sort of putting that together, because you can engineer your prompts in such a way to give it that characterization of what that writing should look like.
We're running up against time as usual here. Definitely happy to continue the conversation. I saw Holly just typed a question in the chat. And I'm not going to say that I'm the expert about any of this, but I have found, sounds like Alaina might differ. I have found Claude to be a slightly more nuanced writer. I feel like when I'm interacting with it, it seems a little bit more natural to me. Um, I just feel like for the types of tasks that I often use it for, it becomes a little bit more useful to me than Chat GPT. However, I will say that I use both. I have the free plan for Chat GPT, so I run out of usage pretty quickly on a given day if I'm actually using it for something. Claude, I pay for because I like it and use it a lot more. And now with the artifacts ability that Claude has. You can turn on this toggle on this feature where it will visualize things. So if I'm trying to create a pretty graph for some data, I can just tell it the data I want and it can make the graph for me. If anyone uses Canva, that's not an AI tool, it's a design platform, but they have an AI tool integrated that does the kind of the same thing now. But my point is, I feel like using these tools will bring you to a level of conversancy with them that will allow you to make your own decisions as to why you pick the one you pick. I will say that I feel like Microsoft's Copilot, I hate to say this because I like Microsoft for a lot of things. I feel like their Copilot is really bad. I don't use that for anything. The cool aspect of Microsoft's Copilot, and actually UAGC turned it on. We can use it as part of our 365 subscription. You log in as who you are, here at UAGC. We can do whatever we want with it. And the cool thing about it is that it is connected to the internet, whereas Claude and ChatGPT and some of the other tools are not connected to the internet by default. Copilot is. So if you want to understand what transactional theory is, it can pull up information, but it's no better than just going to Wikipedia or searching it yourself. And it doesn't really interact with you in a way that the other tools do. So uh, I would say, except for targeted use, stay away from that. But Claude and ChatGPT are really similar. I'm really excited about what Apple's doing. I think that's going to be uh, sort of game changing if you're a Mac person, and I am. I could easily hold up my iPhone or my iPad, which are both right here next to my Mac on my desk here. Uh, Having a system that integrates inputs from all of my devices and knows that inherently I want it to start playing a certain song because I always play it at 4 o'clock, or oh, that's a bad example. I'm just saying I think that kind of intelligent ecosystem is going to be a pretty interesting usage of this beyond academia, beyond writing papers, beyond the stuff we're talking about today, ways it might actually impact our life. That's one of the things I'm pretty psyched about. But if there are other questions, other comments, we're happy to try to address them. I think, again, I think the main thing here is to keep trying some of this stuff out, talk with your colleagues, talk with your program directors, your department chairs, let them know what you're experimenting with, what you're trying. Get in touch with our writing center and our library services, our library support services. They're creating amazing resources uh, around this that probably are not getting enough usage in classes yet. We need to start leveraging what we do have, since we're a university at a time in a position where we don't have a robust response laid out to this yet. Things are being put in place. This conversation we've been having over the last 2 weeks is part of it, but I feel like there are resources coming online that will help us have these conversations with our students. And I think, again, that's the main I would think the main takeaway is just to keep experimenting, to keep trying, and keep talking about what it is you're doing as a way of understanding it better and figuring it out better.